Bob Scully's World Show is brought to you by Lingvari Capital and by Clocks Technologies, lighting the way to a brighter future.
Hi, this is Bob Scully, and welcome to another edition of the World Show, Free Markets, the Lingvari series. This week, we meet the man who would redraw the map of Europe and maybe the entire world while he's at it. A man whom George Lingvari admires greatly, and well he should. Daniel Hannan is a brilliant British statesman, quite young. He's been a member of the Parliament of Europe for the past 2 decades, an MP of Europe, but not for long. Here he is. Daniel Hannan, when people talk about Brexit, whether they're for or against, they get this serious look. You know, it's a serious topic and nobody knows what's going to happen. You, on the other hand, it's quite refreshing. You see all kinds of wonderful things that will happen should it go through, and you start to suggest them. We could do this, we could do a deal with Australia, we could go back to the old Commonwealth and so forth. You're an incurable optimist, fortunately incurable. But are you getting through? Is your message getting through?
I think so. I mean, look, Brexit is going to happen. That's the first point. So many things would need to happen to stop it. There'd need to be an early dissolution, which requires 2/3 of MPs to vote for it. A party would then need to fight the election on a reversal platform, which at the last election, the parties that tried to do that were all slaughtered. There'd then need to be another referendum, which would need to go the other way. There's no change in public opinion. Then that would need to go through Parliament. Then all the other 27 would all need to accept the New Deal. And this would all have to happen before March 2019. So there's some really, really bad analysis of this, which misses the point that we're in a legal process, we're in a timetable. Much more interesting and important is to look at what happens next. And yes, I do see huge opportunities to use Brexit to revitalize the whole world trading system, to have genuinely deep, comprehensive free trade agreements that are not corporatist, but are for the consumer. And starting, indeed, with our friends in North America, where we have congruities of law and language and culture and habit and migration, and where distance, of course, matters less and less.
And you use some very good examples where they cut through the clutter and there's an image to them. You say, for instance, why can't we, the UK, manage our affairs like Switzerland and New Zealand? And those two countries have done pretty well for themselves. But I guess the viewer will think, yeah, but they're small. And they were always well organized, and they don't have these huge political, ideological contradictions and conflicts. Is it a fair comparison?
Yeah, I mean, usually the argument against Brexit is that we are too small. And then as soon as you hear, well, what about Switzerland? Oh, yeah, well, now we're too big. You know, it's not really about size. It's about pursuing the right policies. We want to have the closest relations with our European allies. We want to have a friendly and amicable process, and I hope a mutually advantageous divorce, one that brings benefits to both sides. But we want to live under our own laws. And we want to rediscover our global vocation. We want to be an international free trader, pursuing those links of habit and history and geography that have tied us to every continent and every archipelago. And I refuse to believe that we're uniquely incapable of self-government. When the Japanese and the New Zealanders and so on are perfectly capable of enjoying friendly relations with neighboring countries while making their own decisions, are we somehow not able to do that? Or is it sort of peculiarly racist or xenophobic to argue that in Britain where it's okay everywhere else? I mean, you know, nobody is arguing that New Zealand should merge itself with Australia. And they don't go around saying, oh, these dreadful Australo-skeptics, when are they going to understand that they're just a small island? You know, Japan is not applying to join China, as far as I'm aware. And they don't say, oh, these Sino-skeptics with their imperial delusions. You know, it's a normal, natural, healthy thing to live under your own laws while being interested and engaged with the affairs of every continent, including the ones nearest at hand.
But the examples you give, Japan is not joining China and so forth, New Zealand is not joining Australia, that's joining. But when it comes to splitting and separating, a little bit different. In Canada, for instance, we've been through that.
Yes.
And in the end, most of the separatists, most of the population have turned away.
Yes.
And not because they don't like the idea of a French nation and so on, but they realized it would be costly and complicated. A million little things would come up that don't come up now. There's comfort in the status quo.
Well, although it wasn't,
but
it wasn't just the status quo, was it? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, there was a general devolution to all the provinces, including Quebec and the rest of Canada. And so it wasn't simply that we stayed where it was before. Now, if Britain had been able to do that, if we'd been able to get a slightly looser arrangement within the EU, where we kept some economic and trading aspects of membership, but we recovered political jurisdiction, I think there's no question that we'd have voted to stay in. In fact, I don't think there would have been a referendum.
You would have been for it.
Right, but it was the inflexibility, and not only the inflexibility, but the clear sense of direction. The European Union is not settled; it's evolving. It's constantly moving, and it's not making any secret of which way it's moving. It wants to have a common army and a common police force, a common tax system, and so on. So, the status quo it's a bit like if you're on a bus and the bus is heading in the wrong direction. You realise it's not going where you want to go. And it's written at the front where it's going. You know, federal Europe, it's very clear. To stay where you are, you don't literally remain rigid in your seat. To stay where you are, you actually have to get up and get off the bus.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what we're now doing. We tried to get, David Cameron tried in 2016 to get a looser deal. It was turned down. So logically, we now have to pursue that from the outside.
And one thing I discovered in the research, reading your speeches and so on, that I hadn't realized is that Europe is growing smaller. Europe is not a dynamic part of the world right now. We don't see that way. We go over there, it's beautiful, wonderful things, cities and so on. You mentioned it used to be 30% of the world GDP, now 17.
Right.
That could be a bit of a bias, though, because perhaps the pie is bigger and the 17
yes, that's what's happening.
The
yes.
17 is still worth quite a bit.
Yes, so the European Union is inching up, but sometimes it doesn't grow, sometimes it grows very slightly. In the last 10 years, the Indian economy has doubled in size. The Chinese economy has doubled in size. The Ethiopian economy has doubled in size. The economy of the Eurozone is pretty much where it was in 2008. It just increased by a couple of percent. You're right, it's a gorgeous place to go. I encourage anyone to visit. And I spend a lot of time in continental Europe myself. I speak some of the languages. I love it. But it's not where the action is going to be this century. And for Britain, which is uniquely the only EU country that sells more outside the EU than to the other member states, which has these connections, not just to Commonwealth countries, but really on every continent, it seems crazy for us to allow the EU to dictate our trade and tariff policy, to keep us behind this protectionist European wall, rather than being able to sign our own trade deals and engage and share in the growing prosperity of the markets in Asia, Africa, and the Americas.
I hadn't realized that at some point you say we could have done a deal with India, but we're not allowed. We could have done a deal with Australia.
And now we can.
Now
we can, or we will be when we leave.
But I didn't realize, what is the impediment?
Well, when you join the European Union, you give Brussels 100% control over your trade policy. It imposes your tariffs, it signs the trade deals. So this is not a free trade area. A lot of people, I think, make that mistake. They think that the EU is a bit like NAFTA or ASEAN or something. It's really not. There's no reason why Canada, as a member of NAFTA, couldn't sign a bilateral free trade agreement with the UK. But the UK would not be allowed to reciprocate while it was a member of the European Union. Now, as it happens, Canada is now signing a trade deal with the EU, and the Prime Minister of Canada has said we're going to, when Brexit happens, we will start with that vis-a-vis the UK, and then we can build on it, and we can build on it. I mean, I've always been really irritated, for example, that I can't buy Canadian ice wine in Europe. It's completely banned. It's not just subject to a tariff. It's a classic non-tariff barrier.
Really?
They refuse to recognise the grape variety. Now,
really,
I'm a free trader, right? I think protectionism is always stupid and always self-harming. But even if I were not a free trader, right, whom do we think we're supporting in Britain by keeping out New World wines? Where are the vast vineyards, in Yorkshire that we think we're protecting? This is the insanity of having a collective trade policy set by somebody whose interests are not your own.
But what will be needed is at that moment in history when if this is consecrated and confirmed, like-minded people like yourself, at the head of all these countries to do these deals. If you're facing some retrograde Australian PM who couldn't care less, it won't happen. Same thing with India and so on.
Well, that's true. You take them where you can. However, there are quite a lot of things you can do unilaterally, which don't require friendly people in other countries. And the course that the most successful countries have taken, first Hong Kong and Singapore, and then more recently Australia and New Zealand, was basically tariff reduction that didn't require reciprocity, because they understood that taxing your consumers to buy things hurts them primarily. It may incidentally hurt the exporter of another country, but the far greater damage is done to your own economy. And so they didn't make it reciprocal. They said, we're going to open up and invite the traffic and commerce of the world here. And I think the most spectacular example of success in this regard is Singapore. It's an amazing story. When Singapore became independent in 1960, GDP per head was around half of what it was in the UK at that time. It's now nearly twice. So in that time, Singaporeans have gone from being half as rich as us to being twice as rich as us. And on every other measure, longevity or whatever.
Tiny territory.
Right, tiny territory with zero resources. Zero. They even have to import their drinking water. How did they do it? They invited the traffic and commerce of the world without restrictions. They said, we want to buy the cheapest stuff you can sell us. We're not going to make it difficult for you. And then the cost of living will come down. And our people will have to work shorter hours to buy the basics, and that will free up lots of time for us to invent other businesses. And that's what they've done, and it's a brilliant formula. Works every time.
And something else that you're known for, you wrote a book, a fascinating book, I'm told I want to read it, while drinking some ice wine, on the notion of freedom, how it was invented by the English language peoples initially.
It's true.
When I saw that, it is true, but when I saw that, I thought, whoa, he's going to get knocked here. Must have gotten knocked for this, because it edges close to racial preference or national preference.
Well, it shouldn't,
but,
really.
Well, that's it. When I read it further, Indians turned out to be
the heroes of the story.
English-speaking peoples in your mind,
right?
So it's really a broad notion.
This is. I mean, there is a certain kind of reader or reviewer who is determined to find racism in anything before they've read it, and you're not going to convince them. But I mean, common law and the English language are why Bermuda isn't Haiti. It's why Hong Kong isn't China. It's why Singapore isn't Indonesia. And this is a formula that will work anywhere. It's not to do with the quality of the air or the soil or the genes. It's to do with getting the institutions right and the structures right. If you value private property and free contract and personal autonomy, then all these good things follow. And some parts of the English-speaking world have done that better than others, and some other parts of the world have copied it. There are hugely successful non-common law,
South Korea,
or Switzerland or Estonia, or it can happen. But it's an institutional argument. But you're right. We are shy about saying that a lot of what we now take for granted in the modern world, free speech and free elections and uncensored newspapers and equality between men and women and jury trials and habeas corpus, these were not universal values for most of their existence. These were values overwhelmingly developed in the language which you and I are now talking. And when we call them universal values, in a way we're being polite. I mean, imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Or imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd be nothing universal about them then. If they have become universal values, it is largely as a result, let's be frank about this because we rarely set it out, it's largely as a result of a series of military victories by the Commonwealth and the United States.
But also due perhaps to their greater efficiency, let's put it that way. They beat totalitarian. The totalitarian countries were supposed to be
But also, I think people got that the ideas were preferable. I mean, there was a lovely bit of symbolism. The best of the original 4 copies of Magna Carta, the one at Lincoln Cathedral, was displayed in New York at the Expo in 1939. An incredible 17 million people crushed in to see it. That was how much it was valued by ordinary Americans. The Second World War broke out while it was still on display, and it was transferred to Fort Knox for safekeeping until the end of the conflict. I cannot think of an apter symbol of what we were fighting for in that campaign. In other words, a system that elevates the rules above the rulers and that elevates the individual above the collective. The other side did the opposite. Thank heaven we won.
And you take it back, it's interesting to even before the Magna Carta, you take it back to the Saxon tribes who valued rule of law. The notion didn't even exist. Rule of law over authority or power.
Limited government
or
and so on.
divine right
Yeah,
of
I mean,
kings.
as far as we can tell, and I don't want to overdo this because we're dealing with very patchy records, but as far as we can tell, there was a parliamentary tradition that was common to most of the early Germanic tribes at the end of the Roman Empire that died out in most of Europe. It became, France and Germany and so on became centralized states, and this tradition was lost. It survived on the islands. It survived in Iceland, Faroes, Isle of Man, the places with the really old parliaments. And it survived in Switzerland that was like an island because of its remote geographical inaccessibility. But then it was, it was exported, and there's a lovely passage in Tocqueville where he says, "The American is the Englishman left to himself." Tocqueville had this great theory of what he called the point de départ. He thought, actually, if you want to see the character of a people in the old world, look at how it's played out in the new world. So in his eyes, French America, as he called it, was it replicated the seigneurialism and the obscurantism of Louis' France. And Spanish America echoed the ramshackle corruption of Philip's Spain. But English America he saw as kind of proto-libertarian. He said the Republican and localist traditions that are implicit but muted, they've gone further here.
He loved the town halls.
Yes, he did, and the independent magistracy and the religious pluralism and so on.
And it is true that if we glance back, England, Canada, the United States, Australia have not had a mad dictator like so many other countries have.
We've been lucky, haven't we? I mean, we've never elected any fascists. We've elected the tiniest number of communist MPs. I think Canada had one. We've had like 6 over the whole of our history. And we're in danger of getting one now, though. Actually, in government. This is a whole different thing, which is alarming. But, we'll cross that bridge if we come to it.
But conversely, though, I was going to add, we've not had some of those madmen, but at the same time, those countries that have had them will probably resist the push of libertarianism and rule of law and free markets all the more strongly. Their tradition takes them the other way. It'll be hard for the planet to become, freer trading and so on, or not.
But the direction of travel is good. It is harder for some countries, for cultural reasons and historical reasons. But by and large, the arc bends towards freedom, I would say. There are reverses. I mean, we shouldn't ever make the mistake of thinking that this is a kind of inevitable process, After the First World War, there were democracies all over Europe. By the beginning of the Second World War, there were not. And most of those, for every country that had a dictatorship imposed on it by foreign conquest, there were several that had made that change domestically without anyone needing to invade them. So there's nothing inevitable about it. But by and large, the world is getting better. And that's especially true if you take the most basic measures of human happiness, like literacy, longevity, infant mortality, female education, calorie intake. There's never been a better time to be alive than now. And although there are occasional reverses and there are patches where it's working out badly, the trend is encouraging.
People have noted, always with a smile, sense of humor, that you voted yourself out of a job since but actually you didn't. You're still in the European Parliament.
For another few months,
But why do you stay? Because you get abuse for it, right?
Well, I always did. I mean, if you were a British Eurosceptic, abuse was part of the package. And actually, I don't really blame people, because, was it Upton Sinclair used to say, it's remarkably difficult to make a man understand something if his job depends upon his not understanding it. If you're going to the European Parliament and making a critique of the whole system, of course the people who work for that system are going to take it personally. That's inevitable. But that said, I do have a lot of friends,
but you feel you have to show the flag when you go? Why do you go?
I don't literally show the flag, but no, I mean, I think the challenge now, as I say, is to make this an amicable process. And so, although I'm still getting quite a lot of abuse from, not from friends. I mean, I have absolute Euro fanatical friends who want to turn Europe into a single country with a flag and everything, you know, and they, you know, we just don't talk politics. But I mean, just after the Brexit vote, I didn't like the tone on both sides, and so I occasionally, because I just think it's a friendly gesture, I occasionally speak in other languages, and I made a speech in the chamber in French, and I said, "You're going to lose a bad tenant and gain a good neighbour," and I think that was.
What did they applaud that?
Yeah. Yes, including some of the Federalists, yeah.
And another thing viewers might wonder about, why not be a British politician? I mean, you have all the talent.
I've been
required.
20 years in Parliament. I mean, nobody should ever want to be a politician, right? You might have to go into politics to do something. There may be a cause that you can serve in that regard, or you know, you might just have to step up for some reason of a national crisis or whatever. But nobody should aim to spend their life as a professional politician.
And therefore you won't.
I've got plenty of other plans. You know, especially if you're a free market conservative, you can't help feeling, and I think this is probably true of most of my colleagues, you can't help on one level feeling a kind of existential angst. You disapprove of yourself in principle, right? You would much rather be in the private sector generating wealth for everybody rather than in the public sector consuming it. And after a while, that starts to kind of sap at your soul.
And you're fascinated by examples sometimes on a micro level. It's interesting, you gave a toast to freedom, which was the keynote of the Freedom Dinner, the famous Freedom Dinner, held every year in this city, in Manhattan. And you took small examples of progress around the world through free market techniques, how things were costing less, were becoming more efficient, were becoming more useful. You're proud of that, and you want to be a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing time that we're living through, because what was until recently the privilege of a handful of wealthy developed countries, there is now a realistic prospect of making it general to the entire human race. And the speed of progress keeps accelerating. You know, when we use the word revolution, we mean an event that changes everything. You talk about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, whatever. It's something that nothing is quite the same afterwards. Well, in a technological sense, almost every day is a revolution now, the speed of change. And although that brings challenges and dislocation and problems, by and large, it's a good thing. It's an incredible thing that you and I can now carry in the palm of our hand information that an entire university couldn't have put there 10
Our
years
parents
ago.
wouldn't, or grandparents certainly would never have believed
Unthinkable
it.
for them. Unthinkable. You know, capitalism is achieving things that previous generations attributed to magic or to religion.
And among the many things I learned reading of you and about you and by you, the fact that you were actually a Peruvian anyway, originally. You grew up in Peru. Your father had business in Bolivia.
Yeah.
But here you are, the perfect British revolutionary. So how did that happen? You didn't see your destiny.
What do they know of England who only England know? I mean, look, one of the things about growing up outside the UK is you have a much more positive view of it because you've got something to compare it to. And there's a crippling lack of perspective for some people who they you know, it's the same thing that it's a little bit like this statue tearing down spasm that we're going through. A complete inability to have any perspective. That, you know, Winston Churchill said rude things about Muslims, so he's evil. You know, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, so that invalidates everything he did. The total inability to look at the context of their time and to measure them not by our standards, but by their own. And in the same way, if you've only ever lived in one country, it's very easy to find fault with it and to say, well, this and this is imperfect. And of course, there are lots of imperfections in Britain. We get things wrong just like any other country does. But by and large, most places would swap their problems for ours.
But when you were 8 years old, let's say, living in Lima, La Ciudad y los Perros, beautiful city, very, very different, obviously, from Britain, were you already thinking, when I grow up, I want to be in England?
Yeah, if you have a childhood in a place like that, you notice the differences big time. You notice the small things, like you flick a switch and the light actually comes on, and you know, you turn a tap and the water actually is drinkable, and so on. But you also notice that even if you don't have the words for it, I mean, there was an awful lot of political instability when I was a kid. It was during the Velasco dictatorship. There were
military.
Yeah. It was a hard leftist military autocracy, and it did all the usual mistakes that they did, import substitution and nationalizations and so on. And the country was thrown into a state of squalor from which it really didn't recover until the end of the 90s. And the odd thing was that nobody was that surprised. I mean, that was what struck me, that when there were confiscations or, when there was violence, nobody found it surprising. And I contrasted, I was at school in the UK, but going back to Peru in vacations, and that was the thing that really hit me. It was that people took order and private property and stability for granted in the UK, even though they moaned, right? I mean, in the 70s, particularly, everyone in the UK was moaning, and with good reason. But it was still not like living in a country without the rule of law.
Well, Daniel Hannan, now I know why George Lingvari wants you at his next conference. So I'll tell him, George, give him some ice wine, send him a case of ice wine, and he'll come.
I'll buy some in my duty free on the way home here, right? It's the only way I can get hold of it in the UK.
Well, long life and good luck.
Thank you.
Daniel Hannan was our guest this week on Free Markets, the Lingvari series of the World Show. I'm Bob Scully. Have a great week. Thanks.
Bob Scully's World Show is brought to you by Lingvari Capital and by Clocks Technologies, lighting the way to a brighter future.